Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to give it a few moments as people trickle in this afternoon. Thank you for joining us on what is a sunny Monday here in Philly. Okay, I think I start to see the participant numbers leveling off, so I might get started. Um, So welcome to our Emergency Planning Roundtable. My name is Greg Stewart. I'm the Education Programs Manager at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CCAHA as we call it, and I use he and they pronouns. I am a white person with glasses and headphones and a dark gray shirt with brown hair. My background is currently blurred for the sake of my office mates in our cubicle. And so I just wanted to welcome you all to our webinar this afternoon. Yes, this is rescheduled from earlier in September, so thanks for hanging in there if you were signed up for that original session. Um, and the seasons are, I would say, still changing, and it's the perfect time to be thinking about your institution's emergency plan. So today you're going to hear specifically from CCAHA staff members Maddie Cooper, Dyani Feige, and Katie Lowe for a roundtable discussion on some case studies, some resources, and some tips for getting started and staying up to date with your planning. And from there, we're going to try to kind of have a lively Q&A session and then kind of go from there. So that is a roundtable after all. So before we get to today's presentations, just some Zoom housekeeping. You're in Zoom webinar, which means that your video and audio are turned off, but you can ask questions or make comments to us using the chat feature. Our program today is auto closed captioned in English, and you can turn on subtitles with the little CC button in the Zoom toolbar. Um, so we're going to have some quick presentations from our speakers, the aforementioned kind of round table Q&A session with our speakers that I'll be moderating. And then it'll be your chance to ask some questions. But feel free to drop those questions in the chat anytime during the program as they come up, and I'll be reading them aloud when we get to it at the very end. So today's program is being recorded, and we'll send a recording as well as the PowerPoint and any resources that we've shared in a follow-up email. And I wanted to send a big thank you to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the William Penn Foundation, and the Independence Foundation for making today's program possible. So, just a quick note about the organization I work for. We are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. We are based here in Philadelphia, but we work with organizations and clients all across the country. Our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, documents, artworks on paper, and more. And our preservation services staff work in the field, providing educational programs like this one and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. The center also offers a wide range of digitization services, as well as fundraising assistance, housing and framing, and more. And you can learn more about us and what we do at our website, ccaha.org. So I'm just going to do some quick introductions to our speakers in speaker order, um, and then we'll sort of kick it off from there. In her position as Preventive Conservator, Maddie Cooper works with both the Preservation Services and Conservation departments to carry out preservation surveys and assessments for museums, libraries, archives, and community collections, and to work on treatment projects requiring preventative care. Maddie has worked with a wide range of institutional and community collections. She held roles in conservation collections at Vixaya Museum and Gardens and the Wolfsonian FIU prior to specializing in preventive conservation in grad school. Maddie holds an MS in art conservation from the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation, a BA in chemistry from the University of Delaware, and a BA in art conservation with a minor in art history from the University of Delaware. Dyani Feige works with libraries, archives, museums, and other cultural organizations to conduct needs and risk assessments, assist in disaster planning, and help develop policy and planning documents for collections. She also develops and presents education programs on preservation and conservation concerns. Before joining the staff of CCAHA in 2010 as preservation specialist, Dyani worked in the Brooklyn Museum Libraries and Archives. She has also worked in the New York Public Library's Preservation Division for the Conservation Board and in the Special Collections and Archives at Kent State University. Dyani received her MS in Library and Information Science with a certificate in Archives at Pratt Institute and her BM in Music Business from New York University. And finally, last but not least, in her position as preservation specialist, Katie Lowe conducts on-site preservation needs and risk assessments and assists with preservation and emergency planning at cultural heritage organizations across the country. Katie is a public historian with 10 years of experience in museums, community programming, nonprofit work, and education. She has held positions at the Holocaust Awareness Museum and Education Center, Pennsbury Manor, the Mercer Museum, the Zebulon B. Vance Birthplace, Old Salem Museum and Gardens, and the Mediation Center. She received her BA in History and Education from Ursinus College and her MA in History and Museum Studies from UNC Greenboro. So thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. And I think with that, we're gonna kick things off to Maddie, who will be our first presenter this afternoon.
Thanks, Greg. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I recognize some familiar names in the attendance list. So hi to everyone. Thanks so much for being with us today. My name is Maddie Cooper. I use she, her pronouns, and just a little visual description. I'm a white woman with blonde hair, headphones, a striped shirt, and green glasses. And I'm going to talk a little bit about risk assessment, which maybe you're familiar with if you're familiar with emergency management for collections. But specifically, I'm going to talk about some resources that you might not be aware of and that I want to highlight that can make that risk assessment process easier. So on the slide right now, you see the collections emergency management cycle. And this cycle is borrowed from the larger field of emergency management. So from the federal to the state to the county level, emergency managers use this cycle of risk assessment, planning, response, and recovery to deal with emergencies. And we can do the same when we're dealing with collections emergencies, obviously just at a different scale. And so I always like to say, you know, this cycle is a cycle. It's round. Each of these steps sort of feeds into the next. You're never really finished with emergency management. But it is really helpful if you're just getting started with emergency planning and management for your institution to start with a risk assessment. So Greg, could we go to the next slide? So what is a risk assessment? A risk assessment is basically an opportunity for you to identify hazards and risk factors to your collections, and then evaluate the risks associated with those hazards. And then through that sort of gathering of information, you're going to determine ways to eliminate the hazard or control the risk when the hazard cannot be eliminated. So this is sort of a complicated, the formal definition of a risk assessment can be a little bit complicated. But, you know, if you're to look around the room that you're in right now and do a miniature risk assessment, for myself, I'm sitting in front of a window. So if I were doing a risk assessment, I might say, how good is the seal on this building? Have there been any leaks with this window before? If I had a collection object right in front of me right now, how susceptible would that object be to a leak caused by the fact that I'm sitting next to a window? I might also look around the room and look for the closest fire extinguisher. Is it at a good distance? Has it been inspected within the last year? You know, you're really kind of putting on your doomsday cap a little bit and just trying to identify all the different hazards that could affect collections. And then using that information to kind of think about what you might plan for when it comes for emergency planning. So can we go to the next slide? So you're not alone when it comes to risk assessment, and that carries through for the entire emergency management process. But specifically for risk assessment, there's a lot of different models and guides out there that can help you. You can also, you can do this internally, you can do your own risk assessment, or you can get an external assessor. You can hire a risk assessor to come in, and sometimes it can be helpful to have that second set of eyes to kind of look for things that you might have missed. And there are several different models for doing risk assessment. The one that is pictured on the slide here, the image of the burning structure looks very dramatic, but actually this guide to risk assessment of cultural heritage is really friendly when you start walking through it. It's like a really well put together step-by-step workbook that's going to help you identify different risks and sort of quantitatively measure which are going to be more relevant to your own emergency planning at your own collection. There's also a risk evaluation and assessment program that can help you do this. The National Park Service has a fillable risk assessment worksheet that's great. These are all linked here. And yeah, so there's a lot of different resources out there that can help walk you through this kind of entire risk assessment process. Can we go to the next slide? The first step in a risk assessment is really gathering data. You're trying to gather as much information as you can about your location and your facilities, because, if you're thinking about how much a hurricane could affect your institution, for example, you need to know how a hurricane could affect your area, your region, your location. And you also need to think about how a hurricane might affect your facility specifically. So what's the condition of your roof? Are you located in a floodplain? This is all information that you're going to want to kind of gather before you do any sort of quantitative assessment of those different hazards and risks. And so I always recommend when folks are doing a risk assessment when they're first starting out is just to gather as much documentation as you can, and to get as many folks in the room at the table thinking about this stuff as you can. Obviously, facilities managers, folks who work in security, these folks are going to have a different perspective of what the risks are to your institution than you might as a person who works specifically with collections. So you want to gather as much documentation and as many people into the risk assessment as you possibly can. Can we go to the next slide? So when you're gathering this information, there's a couple different places you want to look. You want to look both internally and externally. You want to gather internal sources like policies and procedures, facilities information, storage and display practices, and emergency event history. If you have that documentation, you definitely want to consider that as part of your risk assessment. And that's that, looking specifically at the facilities side of the risk assessment. And then these external sources are the kind of reason why I wanted to do this segment today, because I want everyone to know that there are some pretty great tools that are available to you when you're trying to answer the question, what kind of emergencies should I actually be planning for in my institution? That can be a really daunting question to approach. But fortunately, there are a lot of organizations out there that are already looking to find answers to this question that are specific to your site, your county, your region. And I just want everyone to be aware of those. So when it comes to looking for external sources for different hazards, one thing I want to mention is the FEMA National Risk Index, which we'll look at a little bit closer to in a second. The FEMA National Risk Index is basically a federal government's snapshot of 18 natural hazards and how they affect all 50 states and also U.S. territories and freely associated states. So that includes, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There's data for all of these places in the U.S. at both the county and the census tract level. This National Risk Index looks at the risk of wildfire to your area, ice storm, hurricane, tsunami. It basically goes through those 18 different hazards, and you can see, if you type in your address, you can see What is the risk of that hazard to that specific location compared to the rest of the state and compared to the rest of the country, which can be really helpful when you're kind of trying to think about what you need to be planning for in your own institution. When it comes to man-made disasters, those are things like cyber attacks, terrorism, um, those types of what we wouldn't normally consider natural disasters. That's when you're going to want to turn to your state and local hazard mitigation plans. And these are basically risk assessments that are being done by state and local emergency managers because they have to create a plan for your state. They have to create a plan for your city, sometimes your county, and they're doing this work for you. So they're looking at all of these different risks, and they are trying to quantify them for each different area that they're responsible for. So they're really helpful to take a look at, and we'll look at one closer in a second. But they're really helpful to look at, especially for those man-made disasters, because these emergency planning officials have already done this work for you of identifying what we should be planning for in your specific area. And then finally, climate resilience. We all know that with climate change comes increased intensity and frequency of natural disasters like hurricanes, severe rain, and severe storms. And so understanding how that is going to affect your area specifically in the near future, as well as in the distant future, can be helpful when you're putting together these emergency plans. And there's a tool called Climate Resilience Resources for Cultural Heritage, which is really helpful when you're looking at these factors. So it will show you things like sea level rise and how different models of sea level rise will affect your area. It can show you, it has a bunch of different data sets that you can kind of layer over top of this map to get an idea of what risks you're looking at in your specific area. Can we go to the next slide? So the National Risk Index, I just wanted to look at this one a little bit more closely. This is showing the National Risk Index for Essex County, which is a county in New Jersey, just kind of picked at random. And you can see here kind of what this National Risk Index looks like. So the Natural Risk Index, like I mentioned, looks at the risk of 18 different natural hazards for every county and every census tract in the United States, territories, and freely associated states. And so it'll come up with a score for each one of those individual natural hazards. And then it also comes up with a compound risk index score. So what we're seeing here is kind of Essex County outlined in this marine color. And you can see that that county is in the 92.75 percentile of risk compared to the rest of the United States. So, this kind of tells us that your county is on the high end of natural risks according to the FEMA Natural Risk Index. Now, this isn't super specific. This type of information is not necessarily something I would want to use in my emergency plan, but it is something that you can use for advocacy. If you're having a hard time getting buy-in from administration, or you're having a hard time getting funding to work on emergency planning, if you can turn to the National Risk Index and say, okay, emergency planning needs to be a line item in our budget this year, because as you can see, we're in the 92.75 percentile of risks. It is more important for us to plan for emergencies than it would be for many of the rest of the counties in the United States. So that's how you can kind of use this compound score as an advocacy tool. But you can also go through and look at the specific risk of flooding, hurricane, strong wind, ice storms, winter weather, riverine flooding. Each of those specific natural hazards will be broken down in the National Risk Index as well. Could we go to the next slide? And this is just a review of all of those different risks that is measured by the National Risk Index for Essex County. So you can see the high risks for this county are heat wave, strong wind, tornado, and winter weather. And the kind of more moderate risks are coastal flooding, hurricane, landslide, lightning, riverine flooding. So maybe when you're thinking about writing your emergency plan, you might focus on planning for those specific events, because you know that those specific events are going to be in the relatively moderate to very high category of risk for your county. Can we go to the next slide? So the National Risk Index is a kind of national look at risk that you can use. But I also want to encourage everyone to look a little bit more locally. Just Google depending on where you're located, if you just Google your state hazard emergency management plan, or Google your county hazard mitigation plan or hazard emergency management plan, or Google your city hazard mitigation plan, emergency plan, any combination of those words, you should be able to find the Office of Emergency Management for the state, county, or city that you're looking for. You know, because of the way that the Federal Emergency Management Agency is structured, states are required to do these hazard mitigation surveys in order to receive specific funding from the federal government. So every state should have a hazard mitigation plan. Most cities will have a hazard mitigation plan, and depending on your area, most counties will have a hazard mitigation plan as well. And that's basically the risk assessment that your specific area is doing. They're looking at, you know, where are all the bridges in this area? Where are all the hazardous material sites in this area? Are we planning, what kind of human caused hazards of concern are we planning for? You can see in Essex County, civil disorders, cyber attack, and disease outbreak are the top 3 things that they're looking at when it comes to human caused hazards of concern. So that might get your wheels turning to think about how those specific hazards might affect your institution and your collection. I think that's the end of the slides that I have today, but I just wanted to, highlight a couple of these external resources. Obviously, you want to gather as many people and as much documentation about your own facility as you can, but you don't need to reinvent the wheel here. You don't need to do the analysis to find out what the risk of the impact of hurricane is to your institution specifically. You can turn to these sources that are already doing that work for you, and it can be a really helpful tool. And with that, I will pass it, I guess, to Greg or Dyani. I know Dyani's presenting next, but I don't know if Greg is kind of managing the transition.
I'm happy to just jump in. So thank you so much, Maddie. So that was a lot of really great information, and definitely a number of resources and other tools for you all to check out at a slightly later date. This is going to be a pretty quick presentation on my part here. Again, I really just wanted to introduce you to some resources looking at emergency preparedness, specifically for from the perspective of digital collections. Just rewinding again, my name is Dyani Feige. As Greg mentioned, I'm the Director of Preservation Services from the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. As a point of visual access, I am a white woman with curly grayish brown hair. I'm wearing glasses and a kind of tan dress, and my background is also blurred partially because there are kittens and they might be number one, too distracting for you to pay attention to my presentation, but also wreaking havoc in the background. But I digress. I am, as I mentioned, going to be talking to you about emergency preparedness, specifically looking at digital collections, because while digital collections, and that can be anything in the digital form, whether it's digitized things that were originally physical analog collections that have been scanned or otherwise imaged, or born digital collections, emails, photographs that were taken digitally, etc. We have to be concerned about emergency preparedness and even response, although the response part is going to be a lot different for digital collections as well as the physical collections. So to start things off, I wanted to just give y'all access to this quiz. This is actually produced through Harvard, and I would encourage you to, hopefully we'll send out this presentation at the end so you can have all of the links and click through and everything. But this quiz is, how digitally immortal are you? So it's a good way to connect the context of digital preservation with stuff that we are all doing every day in our personal and professional lives. So it's a really quick quiz. It's nothing really high level or academic. But it's looking at the way that we care for our own individual digital collections. Again, all of the thousands of snapshots that we take on our phones, the music that we, if you still download music at all to actually have the files, that library of material as well. So yeah, it's a quick quiz. I think it takes maybe 7 or 8 minutes max for any of you who are working within digital collections on a regular basis. It's going to be very kind of rudimentary, but I think it is a really helpful kind of way in to get folks who are maybe not as familiar with the kind of internal fallibility of digital collections. You know, with digital collections, loss is sometimes viewed almost as inevitable. And what can we do to kind of try to mitigate some of that and maybe slow down the inevitable loss? This quiz isn't going to give you answers, but it will at least be a way in to start thinking about it. Next slide, please. So the kind of the main thing that I wanted to talk about, and I'm really not going to spend a huge amount of time describing, but I would really encourage you all to go check this out online. UNESCO has produced a training toolkit covering a range of essential themes in relation to digital risk management for collecting organizations. And it's a book length publication. It is all available completely for open access online. And it has a huge amount of really specific case studies and training tools that can hopefully help you as an organization get started with building up some of your emergency preparedness initiative around digital collections. The specific case studies and training tools are all from institutions and projects in the Asia Pacific, with I think a focus on institutions in Thailand, but it should hopefully be applicable a lot more widely as well. So I would definitely encourage you to check this out, access the contents, download what portions of it you can and seem applicable to your organizations. Next slide, please. This is just the broad strokes overview of the topics of emergency preparedness within the framework of digital collections. These are the training modules incorporated into that toolkit, and every single section has very detailed exercises, forms, templates, case studies, etc. So going everything from, you know, what Maddie spoke about with the understanding your risk phase of risk assessment on into the actual policies and workflows around caring for digital collections, ways in a lot of instances, ways to support community involvement, ultimately the goal of digital preservation. And then it's last, not because it's in any way the final step of this or anything, but just because it is kind of enough of its own weighty topic in itself, but dealing with issues of climate change, specifically looking at digital collections. And I'll get more to that in one moment. But could you go to the next slide, please? I also just wanted to, this is a separate topic, separate resources, but I also wanted to make sure that you are all aware of the concept of digitization and digital preservation as one actual tools in emergency response. And I wanted to talk about that within the context of some of the work that has been happening over the past few years in Ukraine. So, sometimes especially in something as catastrophic as a war situation, sometimes the only thing that we can really do, or at least the first thing that we can do in thinking about caring for collections, is on the digital scale. So when you're not able to do on the ground salvage efforts of the actual books and paper and photographs and sculptures and paintings, not to say that that hasn't been happening in Ukraine, but it is a lot more possible for individuals around the world to get involved on the digital scale with saving some of the contents of the cultural collections and agencies. So the two kind of big projects there that I wanted to make you aware of are Sucho, Saving Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Online. This is an initiative of over 1,500, possibly even more at this point, international volunteers who are collaborating online to digitize and preserve Ukrainian cultural heritage. This is dated at this point, but as of one statistic, some time ago, Sucho has web archived more than 5,000 individual websites. And that was 50 terabytes of data of Ukrainian cultural institutions to prevent those websites from going offline. The websites range from national archives to local museums, to churches, to even children's art centers. So quite a wide range of different types of organizations and different types of cultural heritage being digitally collected and preserved. I wanted to, before I move on to the next project that I wanted to share, I wanted to read just a quote from the Sucho website, which is to the effect that ultimately the goal of this initiative is not to collect and permanently digitally house this material. They write, digital repatriation is a core value for Sucho. The goal is not to create an archive of Ukrainian culture that can be studied safely in the West. We want to return this data to Ukrainian cultural heritage organizations in Ukraine when they are in a position to rebuild. Sucho is only data sitting for now while the war is ongoing. So I appreciated that explanation and that kind of clarification. And I've heard about digital repatriation, but I don't believe that I had ever heard the term data sitting. So I thought that was really interesting. On the less kind of volunteer nonprofit side, I also just wanted to mention a digitization vendor and service provider, Digital Transitions, donated actual equipment to Ukrainian agencies and organizations and helped train staff members and volunteers who were able to be on the ground to digitize collections. They've also done a series of webinars on topics like funding opportunities for digital preservation in Ukraine, and some other topics related to that as well. Next and last of my slides, please. Okay, so I'm not really going to spend much time at all on this topic because I want to have time for the other materials that my colleagues are going to be covering, but I did want to just leave you with links to some additional resources. And this is really only barely scratching the surface on the numerous connections and implications between climate change and digital collections. Digitizing and digitally preserving materials takes a massive amount of energy and resources. It's a little less, a bit of a secondary thought when we are thinking about this less tangible cultural heritage, but it really is critically important that we consider the impacts of this and some of the work that is being done to at least try to address that impact. So there are, even since I put this presentation together, I've seen a handful of other resources along this topic that I think are really valuable as well, but these are just some of the pieces that I wanted to encourage you all to spend a little time with after this program. So, all right, that is it from me. I'm going to pass it over to my coworker, Katie, now. And the next slide. Thanks.
Thank you, Dyani. Hi, everybody. I'm Katie. I'm a preservation specialist here at the Conservation Center. My pronouns are she, her, and for accessibility purposes, I am a white woman with brown hair, brown eyes, and I'm wearing a fuzzy red shirt, and my background is blurred. So as the title of my portion suggests, we're going to be talking a little bit about how even the best emergency plans can be really tested by a disaster event. And while that can be really difficult, that testing can actually inform plan improvement. So we're going to be talking about that through 2 case studies, and I'm just going to dive right in. Greg, can you do the next slide, please? Thank you. All right, so the first institution we're going to look at is the Mummers Museum. This is a beloved institution located here in Philly, in South Philadelphia, and I had the privilege of working with them this year. Greg, could you do the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so just a little background. So the Mummers Museum is a mid-sized institution in South Philly, with the mission of celebrating and interpreting the history of mummery in the city. Collections are really focused on costumes. You can see why. That is also the most rapidly growing collection, as the Mummers Parade happens every year, and they do collect more and more costumes every year. So those costumes date all the way back to the 19th century. They also have photos, works on paper, instruments, as many people do play instruments in the parade. Other costuming components like headpieces and shoes, and then lots of AV equipment and institutional records. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a little bit of additional context specifically related to risk and disaster history. So the building itself, as you can see here, did have a history of leaks and water infiltration, specifically in storage and exhibit areas. These had mostly been addressed piecemeal just because that was what was available to the staff there. Additionally, there had been some secondary mold outbreaks just as a result of water infiltration, again, sort of dealt with piecemeal as they came up. Staff knew that water was an issue, especially given the fact that the roof to this building is flat and the brick pointing was beginning to fail. Additionally, the NRI that Maddie talked about earlier does rate this area as relatively high for risk of natural hazards. If I'm remembering correctly, specific risks include winter weather, flooding, and extreme heat, which is just all of which are true for the entire city of Philadelphia, but especially when you get close to the rivers. So the event that actually happened while I was working with the museum on something else. Essentially, there were 3 large AC units on that flat roof. One of the units had some sort of mechanical failure, which caused water to pool. That then leaked down into the library where most of their collections were stored, most of the mixed collections at least, causing direct water damage to the collections. And then over time, because we had sort of an abnormally warm winter, mold then became a secondary issue. Greg, could you do the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so I sort of wanted to just put this within the scope of the disaster and emergency preparedness and response cycle that Maddie talked about earlier. So if we look at the museum's preparedness, they had recently completed their first emergency plan, which is excellent. And they also had emergency supplies on hand. Again, really excellent. That said, they had not identified salvage priorities, meaning those objects in the collection that they wanted to prioritize for salvage and stabilization in the event of a disaster. Nor had the staff completed any disaster training specifically related to collection salvage. In terms of the immediate response right after the incident, objects in the library were immediately relocated. Again, excellent. That faulty AC unit was switched off, and mold-affected items that were past the point of the museum's capability to stabilize were disposed of. Some costumes that had begun to develop mold were placed outside. The museum has a private parking lot. Those were placed outside in the sun to see if they could dry them out and also deactivate the mold, which made them really vulnerable to potential theft. Because while that lot is private, there's no real wall blocking you from getting into it. Moving on to recovery and kind of like the longer term getting back to normal operations, because we were together on a separate project, they knew to contact us, and I was able to directly consult on some of the refinishing going on in the library, both to better prepare it and insulate it from future water infiltration, but also to ensure that they were using finishing materials that were safe for collection. So that was great that they did that. They also immediately began plans to repair the roof, and to repair those AC units, or replace the AC units with a full HVAC system. One thing that didn't happen immediately was object stabilization. So while things were moved out of, or we could also say salvage and recovery. So while things were moved out of the library, not a whole lot of time was really available for staff and volunteers to do anything for the affected collections, which again sort of resulted in that ongoing secondary mold issue. So with these kind of being some of the issues that they were dealing with, some of the things that were highlighted as a result of the incident, a few just planned changes ongoing. So again, the roof and flooring are going to be replaced in the library. An HVAC system will be hopefully replacing those AC units. The staff now know that they need to identify what their salvage priorities are, and identify safe salvage areas. So ideally not out in the parking lot that is publicly accessible. They're also planning to paint the library roof and the walls inside the library. We always recommend that as something that institutions with a history of leaks and water infiltration can do, just because fresh paint is going to show water infiltration, fresh white paint specifically, a lot faster. They're also planning on installing water sensors and beginning regular walkthroughs just to check anything before it becomes a problem, and identify methods for immediate salvage and recovery, including creating a pocket response plan that can be easily used by people responding to an incident. I really like this example because it highlights a few things really, really well. First is the reality that emergencies will happen. And sometimes we can use them to evaluate some of the small specific things that maybe we don't think to plan for in the kind of large and overwhelming process of emergency planning. Literally things like, so where will we salvage? Do we have a place to salvage? What do we do if we feel like we don't have a place to salvage effectively? I think it also highlights really well how not having those little things fully thought through can actually create compounding issues. So we have, in this instance, the initial issue of the water infiltration, but then not having or a known place where salvage could safely be performed, or time set aside to do that salvage, created a compounding issue of mold development. So this really illustrates the importance of taking the time on the front end to identify those specifics, get that training done, all that good stuff. Greg, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so the next example we're going to look at here is the Lahaina Restoration Foundation. I do not have the privilege of having worked directly with this foundation or its employees, but I was lucky enough to attend AASLH this year and attend a session put on by a representative of the organization, specifically about lessons that they had learned after a catastrophic fire event wiped out a huge majority of both their buildings and collections. So I'm just going to kind of report back here on some wisdoms that I learned. We changed the way I think about emergency preparedness. So Greg, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. Again, a little background and context. So the foundation was originally chartered in 1962 with the original intention of caring for and interpreting Lahaina's places of historic and cultural heritage. Site type and collections were and continue to be extremely diverse. Lots of different historic locations and buildings and very diverse collections housed within. Greg, you can keep going. All right, so Greg, if you could press play there, this is a really good illustration of the severity of the incident. So I think as we're all remember, a series of wildfires sweeping across Maui in 2023, Lahaina was one area that was really seriously affected by that. And this video, Greg, if you could play it again, really illustrates the extent of the damage done to a huge majority of their institutions and buildings. It was really, really, really catastrophic, both in terms of loss of buildings and then collections housed within. And this is indicative of how most of their buildings fared. Greg, you can go to the next slide. So these are some lessons that they reported having learned. I think the thing that was most effective for me was this idea that our memories are nowhere near as good as we think they are. So one thing that their speaker had us do during the panel was to close our eyes and see if we could remember in detail our offices or any space where we were inhabiting daily, with the intention of pointing out that if you were asked, you probably couldn't recall at the drop of a hat the color of the walls in your office or the style of the wallpaper. So the point of that is to really illustrate, if after the fact you're asked to recount what you had in your possession, specifically what it was, what model, what make, what color, when you got it, we probably couldn't do that because when we inhabit spaces on a daily basis, a lot of what is around us becomes wallpaper. We kind of take it for granted. We don't really see it. And sort of the thing that she proposed we do to combat that is to think like a reluctant insurance adjuster. So to approach your own sort of internal recollections and claims with a real air of skepticism, and don't trust your own recollections and make sure that you have physical evidence of what you owned to back up your claims. She also pointed out that inventory is not limited to collections. So in a disaster situation, like a full-on disaster, like what they experienced with the fires, the threat is not only to your historical collections, but also to your literal administrative tools, your computers, your institutional records, the notebook that you use to keep track of your to-do list day to day, the pens that everybody steals from each other back and forth all day. So if you're in a situation like Maddie said, where you know that you're at a really high risk at some point of a severe natural disaster, it's worth it to take the time to inventory not also your historical collection, but also what you're actually using to perform your work day to day. She also pointed out that sometimes it can be really helpful for offsite storage to really mean offsite. So like maybe even ideally in a different county that's maybe not as high of a risk as where the institution is located. The importance of recording items that may seem unusual for your organization to own, as they may be more questioned during an insurance claim. If you go on their website, you can see that they include many different versions of kind of that slide by that I had on the last slide. And that's been a really effective fundraising tool for them, just to sort of illustrate the intensity of the destruction. So at some point after a disaster event, we do have to think about how we're going to raise money to recover. And she was pointing out that those images can be really impactful. Again, the second thing here that was most impactful to me, besides this whole what's your wallpaper question, was the importance of photographing and videoing everything specifically for appraisal and claims. They found that when they went back and tried to make claims on a building and all of the collections house within that had been fully decimated, they tried to submit for evidence to the insurance adjuster a promotional video that had been taken through the building, and it was completely rejected by the insurance adjuster because it was going too quickly. They didn't focus in on specific images of things. It wasn't clear enough. So again, if you're in a location where you're at high risk for truly disastrous situations, maybe it makes sense to take the time to do a really clear and thorough photo and video documentation of what you have on site. So if you're going to do a video, go into each room and follow a path. Land on an anchor image, go to one side of the room, zoom in on specific details about what are there, and then kind of go around the room from each side to side doing that, and then land on the same anchor image. She said that you should update this process as much as possible if there are any big changes to the collection, any major purchases. And if you're going to do multiple videos and multiple pictures, make sure you establish consistent file naming so that you don't have to dig through it to find what you're looking for while you're trying to make claims on the back end. Finally, she pointed out that training takes time. They really struggled with getting people ready to perform salvage on the back end if they hadn't had salvage training beforehand. And so she was just kind of highlighting the importance of really taking the time to do that training so that you don't have to do it after the incident has occurred. And she also mentioned just being really grateful for the fact that her community showed up, and by allowing the community to show up and capitalizing on that help, things were much more quick and effective. Greg, you can move on to the next slide. I'm just going to go through this really briefly because I can see that we're kind of getting close on time. One thing, again, that she really highlighted was the importance of asking really difficult questions in your emergency planning process, even if you don't want to. So they experienced such catastrophic loss that their operations and mission fully had to change, which got her thinking about, well, maybe I can encourage other institutions to really think worst case scenario. So what happens if we do lose an essential element of our mission? How can we pivot? Would we ever be in a situation where maybe we need to restructure staffing? And what could that look like? Who could be pivoted or adjusted in their individual roles? And sort of worst case scenario, again, how might a large scale disaster change what we are capable of, and then therefore potentially change our mission? Greg, you can go to the next one. This is just a QR code. I meant to do a clickable link here as well to their website. If you want to learn more about what the active recovery work that is ongoing there, the website is a really, really incredible place. You can learn more about, the lessons that they've learned, the work that is ongoing, how they've pivoted and changed their mission. It's a really fascinating and ongoing developing case study in the field. You can go ahead on the next slide, Greg. Okay, so just kind of wrapping it up here, some things that maybe we can pull from all three presentations here. So if you were in my webinar last week about inventory, I mentioned knowledge is power, and kind of this idea that when we're stressed about something, a potential issue like, oh my gosh, I'm not prepared enough, I don't know what's in my collection, we maybe have the impulse to avoid it because we're concerned about how bad it could be, which is totally natural. And knowing the state of things is the first step in improving and getting what you need. So know your collection, know your resources, and know what your first, second, and third backup plans are. Be really thorough. Also, try to take small steps. Don't panic. You're not behind. Like Maddie pointed out at the beginning, this is cyclical in its very nature. So it's okay to kind of be doing this work in an ongoing capacity. And finally, all systems have space for improvement. And just because something can be improved doesn't mean it's bad or wrong or insufficient. So if you have an emergency plan and you're like, wow, I didn't think about any of the things that the people here said today, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. let it be what it is for now and know that you have time and resources to make those improvements. And that's it. So I think we're moving on to Q&A now.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. Thank you, Maddie, and thank you, Dyani. Yes, we can move on to the Q&A portion. I think just because we're getting close to time, my thought is that I'll ask at least one of my questions, and then I'll give some time for folks in the audience to ask their questions so that we can make sure that we get to them, because we don't want to leave that hanging. And if not, I certainly have more questions to get to if we need to. So I'm just pulling them up now. We've introduced a lot of resources for you just now. And I think a main takeaway from our program today is that you really don't have to do emergency planning alone. You know, we have those government resources that Maddie shared, some of those amazing resources that Dyani shared as case studies around the war in Ukraine. And then Katie, I think your point about this, what a great resource I hope that we are for you. So a question for the whole group might be just to see if there's any more examples of people and organizations kind of coming together to do this work or to learn from each other.
I can go first. Depending on where you are, I would encourage everyone to check to see if there's a Alliance for Response network in your area. Alliance for Response is kind of a model for creating regional cultural emergency response networks that I think it started in the late 90s. It's facilitated by the Foundation for Advancement by FAIC, for Foundation for the American Institute for Conservation. And it's basically just a model to bring folks working in cultural institutions together with emergency managers and see if there are opportunities for collective action when it comes to emergency management. So I think the FAIC website's culturalheritage.org. If you go to their emergencies page and navigate to the Alliance for Response resources, there's a list of all the active AFR networks around the country. But yeah, those are really, I would encourage you to see if there's an active one in your area.
Absolutely. And if there's not, the FAIC has some tools and definitely has support on getting something like that up and running. I mean, this isn't a terribly specific example, but just kind of a general recommendation. It really is very impactful and productive to do this kind of work in a community, with whether, even if it's just with one other organization that are, you know, located 3 blocks from you, or if you're in a very rural area, you know, 10 miles from you, whatever the kind of relative connection might be, I think there's so much that we can kind of learn from each other. And when it comes to emergency preparedness and response training, I think there is a lot of value in doing it, not in a vacuum. I mean, we have seen at the Conservation Center, we've been teaching programs on salvaging collection materials for many years. And I think a lot of the feedback that we have heard has been from organizations that may be multiple different individuals from across an organization or across, you know, a consortium of organizations in a community, have been able to learn from working with each other, and even just kind of learning the material from it as part of a group. It really contextualizes all of the information so much more when you are able to think of it from the perspective of not just like, okay, this is nebulous. This is facts floating out there in space, but these are facts and these are tools, and this is how I might apply it to my organization. I think just having that extra level of context that can come from working on a project like that within a community is really valuable. I also, just super quick, I'd love to hear what Katie has to say, but I also, as far as a tool, that kind of main really fantastic tool that if you're not aware of, you definitely should check out is the Northeast Document Conservation Center's D-Plan. It's an online tool for developing an emergency plan for your organization. And there's a lot of kind of different ways and levels that you can use it, but definitely worth checking out to see if it might be a good tool for you.
Really briefly, I'm just going to shout out the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, which is co-sponsored by FEMA and the Smithsonian. The folks at Lahaina had nothing but incredible things to say about them. They were like the biggest, it seemed, source of technical and financial support for their situation. I'm going to pop their website in the chat. You know, through them, you have access to technical resources, connections to other organizations that can assist you, and also grant funding opportunities for salvage and recovery.
Thank you, everyone. We're a little over time, but we're happy to stick around for a minute if there are additional questions. I haven't seen any in the chat yet, but just want to give a little bit of time just to make sure that we are addressing questions that may have come up. And I see Dyani has put her email in the chat, so please feel free. Yes, we have everybody's emails here, so please feel free to follow up with all of our speakers if you are looking for additional information. And again, to that network, you know, we are here to help you, and you're not alone in your emergency planning journey. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I'll just kind of echo that. And if I know this is being recorded, so if you're watching this not live, please don't hesitate to reach out. If anyone is located in or around the Philadelphia area, we will be working, we have funding with FAIC to host some intensive emergency training around working within an Alliance for Response network. So we don't have the dates yet, but it'll be roughly a year from now. So I think we're looking at mid-fall 2025. So definitely check that out if it would be of use to you and your organizations. But please, we are, as Greg mentioned, we are here to help and to serve as a resource and to serve as a connector of other resources. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We don't, you know, charge for our time to respond to questions or anything. So.
Yeah, thank you, Dyani. And big thanks to Maddie and Katie as well. And additionally to Camilla Dawson, who's been behind the scenes with all of the tech and setup for today's webinar. Thanks again to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the William Penn Foundation, and the Independence Foundation, and to all of you for showing up today. Our next webinar will be website and social media archiving on November 13th at noon. We hope to see you there. When this program ends, you'll see a little pop-up after your window closes, which will have a survey, and we'd kindly ask you to fill this out to let us know how we're doing. Also, we love to say if you have any suggestions for additional topics for webinars that you'd like to see, please let us know through that survey. And otherwise, I hope you all have a lovely afternoon or whatever time it may be where you're tuning in from. Thanks, everyone.